later. Okay, we're recording and I'll share the screen with you all. Let me know in the chat if you can see my screen, and I'll make sure that I don't move forward until you do. So tonight we'll be talking about knowing the signs of dyscalculia or dyscalculia or dyscalcula. You've heard it all, I'm sure. Awesome, great, Jennifer. Thanks for letting me know you can see it, and Sherry too. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And we have really dug in a lot about this. And research on dyscalculia is still in its infancy. I would say it's about 30 years behind where reading is. We've got a lot on dyslexia, but dyscalculia is still in its infancy. There's still lots of research to be done, and it needs attention. So a lot of what I'm sharing today may change over time, or there might be more research about what we're going to talk about tonight. But I'm excited to talk about this with you. So dyscalculia, that's how I'm going to say it, even though we've heard dyscalculia, there's many ways to say it. Depends on where you live. I'm going to say dyscalculia. So let's do a little word study here. So dys means difficulty in Greek. And we have that with calculare, which is Latin for count or to calculate. And so that's where dyscalculia comes from. So in other words, it means you have difficulty with calculating numbers. Another common term you may have heard of, and one that's in the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is what we use to diagnose a child that's having an issue, but it's called the Specific Learning Disability, SLD, with impairments in math. Isn't that a mouthful? The DSM-5 implies that dyscalculia and SLD in math are synonymous, and there is variance of severity from mild to moderate to severe. And dyscalculia and SLD in math refers to children who have a markedly poor skills at developing those basic computational processes used to solve equations. Like, that's all a mouthful. It just means they just struggle big time with many aspects of mathematics, and we'll talk about that, how mathematics is a type of language. We know that about 6, and we see various stats on this because it depends on your definition of dyscalculia, but between 5 to 8% of school-age children have dyscalculia. So I said, really it's about 6. And in a classroom full of 30 students, that would be 1 to 2 students that have it. And I wanted to share with you this video. This is a gentleman who has dyscalculia, and he does a great job just describing what it was like growing up, and I thought it was worth our time to watch it together. And feel free to chat it up in the comments too as you're watching, and let's go from there.
So college for me was both somewhat exciting but extremely intimidating. All my life, I struggled with math. I could not do math to save my life. 2 plus 2 literally boggled my mind. I was just fractions, decimals, and then you get into algebra where you start mixing like letters with numbers. No, I can't do it. I never could do it. And I remember I got kind of labeled, and I was always put in like the special ed classes for math students, and I just couldn't do it. And I could eventually do it if I studied super hard, and I could grasp it for about a day. But then after that, I would forget it, and I was eventually diagnosed with what's called dyscalculia, and it's like dyslexia, but it's with numbers instead of letters. And it's a math disability that actually a lot of people struggle with, especially with numbers. And so for me, math was extremely hard. And in college, you have to know how to do math. You have to know how to add and subtract and division, simple math. But then also there's algebra and pre-algebra and calculus and just heavier courses that I was going to need in order to graduate. And so that was another reason why I wanted to be a helicopter pilot, is because helicopter pilots don't need a college degree. You need flight time, you need the hours, and then you fly. And so that was kind of the only option that I had for myself, and I limited myself a little bit. But I also believe that if you persist and persist, and you get really good at networking, and you get good at asking questions and leaning on people for support, and looking for avenues and ways to still accomplish your dreams, it's amazing what happens. I think a lot of people sometimes they just see the wall, but they don't see the possibility, the potential. They don't see the other avenues that you could go to get around the wall. They don't think about the strategies that you could take to jump over the wall, or start chipping away to get through the wall. And so I had that mentality, thankfully, that I needed a college degree in order to be able to still function and provide for a future family, and hopefully find a career at this point in my life that I enjoyed and liked. And uh, so for me, going back to school was huge. I had this lady. Her name was Shelley Burrow, and she had done testing where they basically test showing your disability and your logical thinking and what you can and cannot do through your mental capacity, your abilities, your strengths, and your weaknesses. And then she compiles a report, and then every campus has what's called a disability services. And so I went to Shelley, and she did all these tests, and again found out, because of dyscalculia, and my brain, how it works, math was just extremely difficult for me. But my other skills in speaking or communicating or logical thinking were exceptional, and I was able to still function and be a normal person, I guess. And so she compiled this. We took this report to the disability services, and they ended up letting me graduate from college. That's right, I graduated from college without taking one math class. Well, actually, that's not true. I did take one math class, but I failed out of it. I flunked out of it, couldn't do it. But after that, I didn't have to take another math class. I had to take a logical thinking and ethical writing class, and that counted as my math credit. I was a communications major. I studied speech communication and then also emphasized in leadership through the Center for the Advancement of Leadership at UVU, which is one of the highest ranked leadership programs in the country for college students. And so that was an amazing experience. So I embarked in the college journey with this opportunity to get me through. I didn't have to take a math class. I graduated college with a 3.7.
Okay, so why I showed you this is that I liked his analogy of like people just see the wall. They just see the wall and they never think about how they can get around it or over it. One, I think, sad commentary is that he did never really get the support he needed to be successful in a math class. And knowing what we know about the kind of instruction that he would have thrived with, he could have saw that he is totally capable of learning mathematics. And so that's an unfortunate thing. But I share this because he talked about a lot of the things that many of our students are struggling with and how it has affected his life, but how he did not let it to deter him from his plan of being a helicopter cop, which is super cool. And Jane, that's super cool that your son's a helicopter pilot. Like, mucho impressed. That's so neat. So let's talk about some of those signs. He talked about seriously being confused about what 2 plus 2 is. That is a real issue for a lot of kids. So there's signs that we can look at for preschool, elementary, middle, and high school. And this is very abbreviated. There are way more signs than what I'm going to show you, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to cover some of the most common ones that we see. And feel free to drop more in the chat, those of you that know, um, just to help us stay focused and on time today. I wasn't going to cover all of them because it would be very overwhelming. But in the preschool years, we start seeing that they have some issues with counting. That one-to-one correspondence, meaning that they can pick up a cookie and know that that's one, or that they can have 2 cookies and know that that's 2. We see some issues with counting. They might count a finger twice instead of doing it just once. Another common issue is that we see like a quantity disconnect. If you told them to bring you 5 blocks, for example, they might bring you 3. And that's an issue and kind of a sign that there's something going on there about their mathematical reasoning. Another common problem is that they struggle with sorting and categorizing things and understanding what goes together and what doesn't. It could be as simple as colors or shapes, or animals. That kind of thing is a mystery to them, and they really struggle with that. Another common issue is time. When you're a preschooler, it's not necessarily that you're trying to learn how to tell time, it's that they have no concept of time. They're not really sure how 5 minutes feels. Or if you give them like a warning, like, oh, we're going to leave in about 10 minutes from the park, they have no idea how long that really is and could ensue like a lot of tantrums because they have no concept of time or rhythm. And also, us parents, we can also be messing with that sense of time. If we say 10 more minutes, but we give them 20, we're really messing with that internal clock that they're trying to develop. So that's something to be thinking about, that some kids are very sensitive to that and don't have that sense of time. They also struggle with recall. Like if you were to teach them their phone number or something like that, that would be something difficult, or their address, something they might not be able to do. They may be able to remember it, like the gentleman said in the video, for a day, but then the next day it's gone. Kind of like that movie 50 First Dates, where she can remember stuff for a day and then she goes to sleep and the next day it's gone. It's kind of similar to that. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to teaching your child math facts. You think they've got it, they go to bed, the next day they're gone. You don't know where they went. That's an issue. That points to dyscalculia. In elementary and middle school, some of the common issues that we have here is you start seeing that they're way behind their peers. They might have been keeping up and doing okay first grade, then second grade they get further behind, and then third grade it gets significantly difficult and it becomes apparent that there's an issue, something's going on. Math fact recall, the 51st States example here, they struggle to remember, especially if we introduce a time constraint to it. These students are not going to be able to deliver the answer in a quick time because most of them have very unique ways of arriving at the answer. It's not as simple as memorization. That's not a strength for them. And so that's a struggle for them. And we're talking about math facts, all types, from addition to subtraction, multiplication, and division. The vocabulary of math is a problem, and they get confused about what things mean. They might confuse operations. It feels like a complete foreign language to them. Reading charts is also confusing to them. They're not really sure what this means in the real world. It's a difficult thing. And then you'll see poor alignment. So they might be writing some math problems and they start sliding towards the edge of the paper, or they're all over the place. And so place value is lost because they have poor alignment issues. And so those are some of the things you start seeing in elementary and middle school. But if you've got a high schooler that's struggling, some of the things you'll see here is like a reliance on a calculator to do simple calculations like 4 plus 4 is 8. And I have even seen memes, right, floating around on the internet about that, like, just to make sure. And no, really though, like a kid with dyscalculia would do that. They are not sure of themselves, and so they use it for simple operations. Again, they're significantly behind their peers. When everyone else is learning algebra, the student's still struggling to grasp and understand fractions and ratios and proportions, or even further concepts behind. I've worked with a student before who was a ninth grader who did not have the concept that the number 5 was 5, like it was the quantity of 5. That was something she had never figured out. Again, she was relying on the calculator to do all the calculating. She could punch in the numbers in that calculator, but she had no concept or number sense to know that the answer was correct. In high school, they struggle with directions. Our poor teenage drivers get lost a lot because their directionality is hampered by this dyscalculia. Thank goodness we've got, phones that can give them directions, but even telling the difference between left and right is difficult. And so there's going to be a lot of anxiety around that. And that might be one of the reasons that they're struggling, is because they've got dyscalculia, which is messing with their directionality, with their spatial awareness. You'll see a lot of them struggling with graphing, again, because they might have a deficiency in that one-to-one correspondence when they were a little kid about counting out an object and having it be correct. That translates into an issue when they're in high school, and graphing is hard because you're touching the lines and counting at the same time. And you'll see kids with these issues hovering, their pencils hovering in the air. and they struggle to know where to start and how to start counting. And then they have high amounts of anxiety. By the time they reach high school, and if they've never received interventions or that work, the anxiety is at an all-time high. We had a student a couple of years ago that came to us that anytime she had a test, she would spend the entire day before throwing up, just from the sheer anxiety of knowing she was going to go into that test and not be able to show what she knows. Because it turned out from her assessments, she did know quite a bit of math, but again, because of how she processes, it was so slow that she couldn't show in that time constraint what she actually knows. So that's really frustrating. And that's some of the general signs of dyscalculia. I'm sure there's others. And if you feel like it, drop them down in the chat below and we can talk about them. But a lot of parents view this and they think, okay, let's fix this. Is there a cure? I'm going to find it and I'm going to fix it and we're going to get rid of this deficit. But I really want you to understand that there is no cure. There really isn't a cure. At the end of the day, this isn't something we can necessarily control about your child, and that there's nothing wrong with them, really. Their brain is wired this way. It's a brain wiring difference. It does not mean your child will not be able to learn to reason mathematically, but rather they have to be taught in a way that's systematic and specifically works for their brain wiring. And no two brains with dyscalculia are wired the same. So most likely your child's in a classroom that values that procedure and memorization, which is super hard for them. It's working in all of their weaknesses. But your child can discover and will discover with the right exposure to the correct instruction that they do have a brain that's wired for math. It's just that it's all about how it's presented to them. I'm going to go to the chat for just a second. Lindsay's saying that my son last year in second grade was going to the nurse every day during math with anxiety. Yeah, stomach aches, anxiety, school refusal, they don't want to go. That's also another big trigger. They have they have an actual fight or flight response, right? When it comes to math, they want to run away from it. Michelle says she sees a challenge with word problems and multi-step problems. For sure, absolutely. That's another sign that they're struggling. They are lost in that vocabulary. They have no idea where to start. And that is really frustrating and difficult. Jennifer is saying that in preschool and elementary, they're avoiding games with numbers. Yes, we see that too. It's really frustrating because they know that it's going to take longer for them to figure out what's going on, and that's embarrassing. And so they avoid it to, not have those feelings. So those are all really good examples, and I would love to hear more as the night goes on. Valerie asked, what about avoiding doing homework? Yeah. Yes, avoiding homework is also an issue, but I think it's interesting that they do mostly fine on their quizzes and tests. That's interesting. Valerie, at the end, I would love to hear more about that and talk to you about that. So let's save that thought for the end, but I'm going to keep going. So let's talk about the co-occurring conditions that show up with dyscalculia, because usually it's not an isolated issue. It usually has something else that's also affecting it. And all of those things, any of these can also affect your ability to do math. So some of them could be dyspraxia, dyslexia, which if you were at my last webinar, we talked about how dyslexia affects math. ADHD, that attention, sensory processing issues, autism, math anxiety, and generalized anxiety disorder, that's what GAD is short for, and depression. So all of those also affect math and make it really difficult to learn. So you could have dyscalculia and any combination of these. And again, it's not that your child's broken and they need fixing, it's that they need a completely different approach and way because their brain is just wired differently. So how is it diagnosed? So usually you go to a neuropsychologist, sorry, I'm abbreviating, a neuropsychologist, and they'll run like a battery of tests. The school can do this as well. So a popular one is the PAL-2. It's a diagnostic assessment We have the key math. I've used this one before. And then we have the Wyatt 3. And then my personal favorite is the Pfeiffer Assessment of Mathematics. I really like this one because the first three, yes, can show that there's deficits and issues. But what I like about Pfeiffer is that it really shows that it's a spectrum and that there's issues. And he kind of provides us with categories for us to look at this. And we can think about it from mild to severe and talk about it with more pointed intervention. So I was going to show you a little bit more about the Pfeiffer assessment for mathematics and why we like it so much. And I apologize that this is kind of blurry. This is from a report. So how the Pfeiffer Assessment of Mathematics, or the FAM, works is that he categorizes the data into 3 buckets or indexes. The first one is procedural. It's sequencing, counting, ordering, following a procedure. Looks at like your working memory and your ability to hold and use information. And then there's another bucket called the verbal index, where we're looking at that math fact retrieval, the language of math, the vocabulary. And if you have a child with dyslexia, that number for that index will typically be lower. Then the next bucket is the semantic, which is visual, spatial, the concepts of math, including magnitude. So this is your number sense. How big is something? How small is something? Those kinds of items. And then they also look at like their mathematical reasoning, and some of the kids struggle with storing it in a way that's accessible to them. So it also has to do with that storage and retrieval. So the severity of dyscalculia will depend on the scores in these 3 indexes. And we're going to look at some examples of this. If we see below scores in all 3, you could say that dyscalculia is severe and affects their everyday life, from telling time to getting from point A to point B to counting cash back at the store, on and on and on. If lower scores exist in only 1 or 2 indexes, the student would be considered to have mild or moderate dyscalculia. And so that's interesting for us to look at. So I have some real data for us to look at together. So this one is just showing an average score. So the blue bars are the procedural index, that ability to carry out the plan step by step. The green bars are that verbal, the language part of math. And then the red bars are the semantic, like the magnitude, understanding how math works. And then that dark line in the center is the average line. And so as we can see in this data, this is data from an actual student. The student's performing at an average level and would not be categorized as someone that has dyscalculia. There are some below average scores, but with good instruction, this student would be able to perform at the average level. This particular student came to us because they were gifted, and that giftedness, if you had average scores, it would feel like a deficiency to them. It would feel like a struggle because they could perform at a much higher level. So that's an interesting note that I thought I would offer too. In this particular student's data, we can see that there's 1 spike of strength in the procedural index. This higher score displays a strength in repeating number sequences. So they're like strings of numbers that that are being read out loud to you, and you repeat them back. So that means that this student has a high memory capacity to hold those numbers in their working memory. And a student like this would benefit from repeated terminology tied with gross motor movement to use the strength to build the other weaknesses. So for example, we could do some skip counting combined with gross motor movements, or manipulating beads. Many of you that work with us, your students have beads on strings and that kind of stuff. That is partly why we use it. Unifix cubes also can help them with showing multiples of the number and learning those multiplication math facts. So this student's data would say that they have a moderate dyscalculia that affects their daily life, in the middle, about there. And this student has a strong strength in visual spatial reasoning. So multisensory math would for sure be a winner for this student because they would respond to all that visual stimulus, and they would be using that clear strength to buffer and build all those other skills. So examples of strategies for this would be using like manipulatives to aid understanding, graphic organizers to help with recall of information, acting out word problems, and using graph paper for alignment. And this student, we would say they have mild to maybe moderate dyscalculia that affects their life. It's affecting them. But with that visual spatial, they probably have a lot of compensating activities that they do. And so that's why I say mild, moderate. And then this student, the student has some data that barely even registers. And you can see some of them are like 1%, like it's really low. The dyscalculia could be severely debilitating in their life with numbers like this without uniquely tailored instruction that can focus on what the student can do. Again, like even though we see numbers like this, my team does not freak out. We know that we can help this student. It's severely affecting their life, but with the right instruction, we can really help them make gains. So in general, we can see that students with low scores in the verbal index, that might mean that they have dyscalculia, or not dyscalculia, dyslexia. And we would never say that these students can't learn. A great quote that Sally found from Dylan Lin, who is a statistician with dyscalculia, and he graduated from Cal Berkeley, which is impressive. But what he said, or what she said, was, we don't say people with dyslexia will never learn to read, so we shouldn't say that about people with dyscalculia, that they can never learn to do math. Again, like dyscalculia is a brain difference with processing. It's not a deficiency in intelligence. It does mean that the student will be severely impacted in their daily lives without that instruction that's for how their brain is wired. So the good news is that this student does have some skills that we can build on. They do have strengths. Even though they're below average, we consider those strengths and we can use those to build the deficits in the other areas. So again, no two students are alike. Dyscalculia is a broad umbrella term, but the FAM helps us categorize and identify the struggles, but also clearly see the strengths of each student, and this guides our accommodation. Okay, let me check in on the chat really quick. Sally's helping Valerie, that's great. And Jane, do you recommend testing for an 8-year-old who struggles with math, or just pursue help through multisensory math instruction? Jane, your situation is a little bit different because you're doing homeschool. If you ever decided to put your kids in public school, I would recommend getting some testing done because you would want those accommodations available. But if you're planning on just continuing to homeschool, I don't know that it's totally necessary to go get that additional evaluation unless you were just curious. I would use it if you're going to put your kids back in the public school system or private school system. Yes. Yeah, okay, good. You're going to keep homeschooling. Yeah, it's, they're expensive tests. So that's why I tell you that. But if like you have stellar insurance, I mean, why not? But most families don't necessarily have like the surplus to go get that testing done. Very expensive to do, yes, privately. So let's go over some of the accommodations you can do around those 3 bucket terms of procedural, verbal, and semantic. So the procedural accommodations, I'm just going to mention a couple because really Sally and I, we could have been here all night talking about some of the things you could do. And so I think we'll deep dive into these topics at a later point, but we'll talk about them briefly, just a few of the ideas so that we have time to take your questions. So for the procedural, an awesome idea is to have some visual vocabulary cards. This really helps our students. So you can see here that we've got an acute angle. Acute is hard. It's a weird word, right? And so having this visual vocabulary here helps us see that acute means it's little, it's a smaller angle. And that really visually sets apart the word, and they can remember that and grasp it. It's very brain sticky. It helps them recall that information. So creating visual vocabulary cards with the student. You could, of course, probably go find some, like in the marketplace or on Teachers Pay Teachers, there might be some there, but creating it with the student gives more meaning to the word. If you can talk to the student about the vocabulary and what does it mean, and then have them draw a picture that makes sense to them, that is such a beneficial activity, and it's more likely that child will be able to recall that information. Another favorite that we do, and many of the parents that work with us have probably seen these in the sessions, is we use visual checklists and cues for our students. In other words, it's called a near point reference. So one thing that's really difficult for our students is if they're in a classroom setting and there's something on the board. A lot of teachers make these great graphic organizers, but they're up on the board, they're up really far away. And that is difficult for our student to translate down to them in front of the paper. So we actually give them near point references, something close by that they can use. And so if you're a teacher, that's a tip, is to either take a picture or make a digital one or some sort of printout and allow the student to keep it on their desk rather than up on the board. Up on the board, sure, works for a lot of students, but for students with dyscalculia, that's just too far of a distance and they cannot hold that information long enough to use it. And so having a near point reference and a visual checklist really helps. An example of this would be order of operations. Instead of just writing just the acronym PEMDAS, which doesn't have a whole lot of meaning for the students, here the letters are organized in the way that we're working with them. First, we're starting with parentheses and the exponent. Then we're doing multiply and divide from left to right, which is really difficult if you struggle with directionality to remember which one. We're always scanning the problems left to right, and that's why there's arrows, and then add and subtract. And so we even have an animated video of this to help the students remember, gives them something to hang on to when they're working on those order of operations. The center image is sequencing buttons for long division. And again, these buttons allow the student to touch and with like their non-dominant hand to touch it and do the steps with their other hand to help them remember which one goes next. And then the third image that you see here, this is for our older students solving equations. We use the phrase like, who's messing with my ex? And middle schoolers, oh goodness, they love this. They think it's hilarious. So that's the first question. Who's messing with my ex? That helps them focus on the right part of the problem. And then they have to ask themselves, well, how are they messing with my ex? We're identifying what operation is happening here. Then we do the opposite operation, and there's a cue you can see here, plus and minus, multiply and divide. And then they have to apply it to both sides. The nice thing about this organizer is we get the language down so tight that the students know to say who, how, opposite, both sides. And so if they're ever lost and they just need a little hint, we can say one of those cueing words and they will remember immediately what step they need to do, which is really awesome. Let's talk about the verbal accommodations. So this is an area where if you've got a child with dyslexia, they might be struggling with these. One of our favorite things is to do etymology, which is the study of the roots, prefixes, suffixes, all that good stuff. And so let's look at perimeter. Perimeter means peri, which means around. And we have metron, which means to measure. So we're measuring the distance around, and we tie this with gross motor too. We do it with our hands. We're doing the area, not the area, the measurement around, that's perimeter. And then area is the space covered, and we wave it with our hand. But we do practice with the gross motor. So that really helps our students see and understand that we're going around the shape. Another really good practice is to tie it to other ideas and words that they might know about. So you could talk about a periscope on a submarine and how the periscope goes up and it's looking around to see what's out there on the water. You could talk about peripheral vision. Here, this I think he's a Marine. He's having his vision tested, and peripheral vision is the ability to see around, and you can wave your hands to the sides, and the students can see that their hands are moving without their head moving. That has that peripheral in there, even though we say it a little different, it has peri in there, which means around. And again, we could put this all in a visual dictionary for them, and it will help solidify the language that's being used here. And there's tons of awesome words that we could do this with. And so that etymology really helps them understand what's happening and they will not forget. And perimeter and area, students get them mixed up all the time because they are similar. But once we do this etymology, it's less likely they're going to get them confused because of the ties that we made. Another important thing is to narrow the math facts that you're working on. A lot of teachers focus on learning an entire math fact family, and let's talk about multiplication. So a lot of teachers will focus on, we're learning all of the sevens, and they spend just a few days on it, and then they're going to learn all of the eights. And the students don't get enough time with each math fact family for it to be a rapid recall for them. And so what we need to do is narrow the set that we're working on. And we get so far in that we're working on sevens and we're working only on half of the sevens. And then what we do is we use it in our work throughout the week, throughout the month, however long it takes. And the students are learning other topics, but we're narrowly focused in on these math fact families. And math fact fluency comes with time and repetition in a non-timed experience. And then we give our students these beads here, for example. So this is our math facts of 7. This is their near point reference again. Students can touch it and use it for all sorts of operations with 7, adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, and they can even do fractional thinking with this. So we're big fans of the strings and beads. They are harder for younger children to manipulate, so you might want to get bigger, chunkier beads for those younger students, but for upper elementary, middle school, they're great. We even use them with high school students. And then let's talk the semantic part. So this is the understanding magnitude, how numbers work, your number sense. Number sense is so important to teach explicitly. If you've got a child that's avoiding those games and whatnot, it's because they're looking at these dice, they're looking at these dominoes, and they're unclear on what they mean, and you have to explicitly teach it. So this is an example of us teaching the pattern of 7, and that 7 has a couple different patterns, 6 and 1, 3 and 4, 2 and 5, and that we can use it to help us do mental math. But sadly, mental math people think, oh, we shouldn't have to write it down or whatever. We'll just practice it until it's learned. Again, the student needs that near point reference and that explicit instruction to show them, okay, I'm going to do 9 plus 7. I'm going to take the 7 and I'm going to break it apart into a 1 and a 6 so that I can make a group of 10 and add 6. And then we build up to the mental math over time. And this idea is really important. Students can usually manage numbers 1 through 6 without too much problem. As soon as we get up to 7 and beyond, it gets really difficult. And so we explicitly teach these patterns to our students and how to use them and when to use them. It's really, really helpful. Another thing we do is lots of hands-on math. We're a big fan. So this is an image from last summer. Dorothy Fox and I were actually here in this classroom together last summer, helping Marilyn with her classes for middle and high school students. And this was a group of high school students. Marilyn Zucker's my mentor, and she is amazing. She's dedicated her whole life to teaching students math. She has dyslexia herself, so she intuitively knows how these students are thinking and how to remediate and how to help them. So this particular class was the high school students, and we were working hands-on with base 10 blocks to give them refreshers of how place value works, because place value has a tie to exponents, which is also a type of place value organizer. And so we needed them to have a refresher on how these numbers work. And so we built these quantities so that they could see what they look like. And so you can see on the screen that we were building 2,258. And she was showing it in expanded form, but also in block form. And the fun thing is we went out in the hallway and we also built we built that 10,000 rod, then we did 100,000 flat, a million cube, and then we did a 10 million rod. And we didn't have that many blocks, but we used a yellow rope to symbolize the size. And this really helps the students grasp and understand the magnitude of the numbers that they're working with. The hands-on piece is really important. And so even though these are high school students, we were teaching them in a way that was not offensive. This didn't feel babyish to them. They were happy to be there and playing with these blocks, and we would make connections to the kind of work that they were doing that was appropriate for their grade level. So another thing that also causes problems is math anxiety. Sometimes a student maybe doesn't have a ton of deficits in math or issues in math, but it's just anxiety, but sometimes it's both. But let's talk about what can cause some of these anxieties. Some of it could be a chemical imbalance from that generalized anxiety, and medication can help with this to rebalance those neurotransmitters. DBT therapy that teaches skills of self compassion, resiliency, and minimizes that catastrophic negative thinking patterns. I'm stupid. I can't do this. Math is out to get me. I will never learn. Those kinds of things. That kind of therapy can help them undo that thinking. Another issue for math anxiety, sadly, is shame. Not necessarily from you, the parent, but sometimes it is. Maybe one of the parents is sending shameful messages without realizing it. Um, or it's a teacher or a sibling or a peer that's telling them they just need to try harder, to stop being lazy, act your age, be more responsible, quit making careless mistakes. Um, these are things that our students can't do. And so they're feeling so ashamed of these behaviors because they don't know what to do about them. And they have been ignored for a really long time. And so these students just don't have the skills necessary to perform and complete their expectations. So Ross Green, I don't know if you know Ross Green's, but he's a great psychologist. So he says that kids can do well when they can. If they could, they would. Generally, kids want to do their best. It's not that they won't do it, it's that they can't do it. So do kids manipulate? Sure, it happens. However, there's always an underlying need that's not being met when they do that. So that's part of that anxiety piece. Repeated failure is a huge one for these kids. Over and over, they feel like, I can't do this. I try, and I fail, and I can't ever seem to get it right. And this causes depression, hopelessness, and leads to meltdowns, tantrums, defiance, unwillingness, refusal to try. This is where they're like, I'm not going to school anymore. You can't make me. It's that kind of stuff from that repeated failure. And then lastly, we have the issue of time tests. Again, our students with dyscalculia, it takes them up to 50% longer to process something than the average student. Time tests cause that anxiety. It shuts down their working memory, and they are unable to go retrieve that information that's in their long-term memory and show what they know. If we can give them more time, typically the students can show us that they do know a lot. Because of the way they think, the divergent way they think, it takes them longer because they don't know inherently, 4 + 4 is 8. They might have a different way of getting to it, and it just takes longer. And so those are some of the things that cause math anxiety. There are other things, but I wanted to share some things that you could do to help with anxiety. So with the repeated failure, one thing that you can do is really help your children view assessment as feedback, to not take it personally. That requires a lot of patience on your part, encouragement, and coaching. Did I mention it takes patience? Like, your student, your child will not believe you at first, that it's just feedback, that this is not a measure of who you are as a person. This does not mean that you are broken, that you are a failure as a person. It's just feedback. It just means you don't quite know it. We had a student that we were able to successfully coach with this mindset. Often she would bring her tests and feel defeated, and we would review it and go over it. And it turned out she started discovering, like, oh, I actually do know how to do it. It's just that I didn't calculate this correctly, or I didn't label this. That makes a lot of sense. And so she started making checklists of things that she would want to quickly review at the end of her tests. And before you know it, she started seeing, like, oh, I actually do know this stuff. I actually can do it. And then the other thing that really helped was her school allowed her to retake tests as many times as possible, which really helps with growth mindset. So if you have a school that does not allow multiple retakes, I would advocate for that. It helps a lot of students. There's good research on that, unlimited retakes. Kids will abuse it at first, and then they realize it's for real and legit. And it really weeds out the students that are struggling and need more support, and then helps the others see that they can do it, right? And so we can give that support to those students and let them see that they really can learn these things. And so going back to that student, if we fast forward to today, she came to us in middle school feeling like she couldn't do it, that math would not be part of her future. To this year, she is a senior in AP Calculus, which is something she never thought would happen. And she is so excited about her future and knows that she will be just fine in college because she figured out she can do math. It just has to be explained in a way that her brain understands. And then she is learning on her own how to attend to those details, which comes over time with that view that this is just feedback, not an assessment on you as a person. We mentioned that extra time thing. As you could see in the FAM data, that lots of students had lower numbers in the procedural index, which is that working memory, processing time, executive function. Our students need 50% more time than the average student. So time tests can cause a great deal of anxiety. It shuts down that learning process and blocks that retrieval of information. So make sure you're advocating for extra time on those tests. It really can make or break the experience for them. Another interesting idea is to take a break. Sometimes you just need to take a break from math instruction. And the anxiety is so high that it makes it impossible to learn. And after working with kids close to 20 years, I've learned that there's always a time to learn. So don't give up completely, but do take a break. Take a break and do some sort of art mixed with geometry, and then you can try again. And sometimes those breaks are long. Sometimes they're months long before your child's ready to try again. And then when you try again the next time, make sure it's with the right kind of instruction, and I think you'll see much better results. So we're getting close to wrapping up here. So if you've got questions, start thinking about those. But I wanted to share with you that there is hope. There's so much hope to be had for these students. And again, I just wanted to remind you of what Dylan Lin said, a dyscalculic statistician. That's such an amazingly hard job. And I can't even imagine the math that she went through to get that degree. And again, we don't say people with dyslexia will never learn to read. So we shouldn't say that people with dyscalculia can never learn to do math. It's just not real. So if you've got good instruction, your child's going to learn. They're going to see that they can do this. And the fun thing is it starts spilling over into other areas of their life, and their confidence increases across the board. Oh, so what's necessary for people with dyscalculia? What kind of teaching am I talking about? Well, it needs to be simultaneous, multisensory with that visual, auditory, kinesthetic, tactile. So hands-on, gross motor, all of that at the same time. So teaching is done using all the learning pathways in the brain, that visual, auditory, kinesthetic, tactile, at the same time. That really makes a big difference to these students. So if you could involve gross motor when you're doing that etymology, that's going to help the student remember the math vocabulary better than just trying to memorize it. The other piece that's really important is it needs to be systematic and cumulative. Multisensory instruction requires that the material flows in a logical order. We start with the most basic and we progress towards the advanced. We work from what a student knows to new material. Math is one of the few subjects in the world that builds on itself. So having that strong foundational skills makes a big difference. If we have a student in high school that doesn't have that strong foundation, we go backwards, fill in the holes, and jump forward to what they're doing. It's really important. The other piece is direct instruction. We never let students explore and just leave them to come up with the connections on their own. We don't do that. They need to be taught explicitly how it works. We don't leave them to infer or arrive at a connection independently. They're taught directly. They're coached to see connections through that student-teacher interaction. And if a student needs us to back up even more, we do that to help bridge that understanding. The other piece that's really important is it's diagnostic. We provide individualized and prescriptive teaching. What we do is not a scripted program. We're not a piece of software that you can just go get. It's a lot of the stuff that schools are doing are prescriptive and, scripted out, and the teacher's walking around with a teacher manual in their arms. Like, that's not going to serve these students. We gather data on the student and use this to guide our instruction, and we aim to have our students master a topic and so that they can move forward. The other piece is it's synthetic and analytic, meaning that we teach the parts of math and show how they work together to be part of a whole concept. And analytic means that we show the whole concept and teach how it can be broken down. So they're like inverses of each other. We should do part to whole and whole to part. That's really, really important for our students. It's a game changer when we can do instruction this way. Okay, so if you've got questions for me, I'm sure Sally's already been helping you because she's amazing, but you can start chatting and adding your questions here. I've got about 10 minutes left, but I'm going to stay on and talk with you and all of that. But let me share like some of the happenings and goings ons at Made for Math right now, and then I'll answer your questions. So currently we have coming up in January some multi-week classes. If you'd like to try out multisensory instruction, come check these classes out. There's this link down below. I'll send it out with a recording. But classes are starting in January. So head over to this page. Let us know what topics you're interested in, what time zone you're in, the age of your child. That will help us form the classes and make sure we're offering what you guys are interested in. Multi-week classes are very popular and people like them. They've been really fun to do too. And then the other thing too, I thought I'd mention before I jumped on the call, I took a quick peek to see how we were doing with availability. We do have a couple spots. When I say couple, I mean like 3 or 4 at the most. We have a few kids in the queue to be placed, so maybe it's more like 3 kids. So if you're interested in working with us in a one-to-one situation, I encourage you to come over and check us out. We call them solo lessons, and we're using those strategies that we talked about. We mail all the materials to your house, and your students getting an intervention that's custom made for them. Nothing we use is cookie cutter. It's all custom for the student. And so with that, I'm going to take your questions. I'm going to stop the share here. Okay. Oh my goodness. You guys have been busy in the chat. This is great. Okay. Sally, looking at the chat, which questions do you feel like we should start with first? And I'll let you unmute yourself if you feel comfortable.
Okay, so I've been answering quite a bit, but there's several that I haven't gotten to that have popped up. Let me just go back and look to see if you had a comment on this one right here on Lindsay's question. I commented to her, but I wanted to get your take. So Lindsay said, so I too have dyscalculia that was never diagnosed as a child. So math is something that just debilitates me. My son is approaching multiplication and I have horrible flashbacks of the torture that was for me. I feel like there's not much point in torturing him now because I feel he is more severe than even I was. How necessary is forcing these kinds of kids to memorize math facts like that?
Okay, Lindsay, I'm so glad you asked it. And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that it's a struggle for you too. I think there's a lot of power in that. And I hope you will talk to your son about that. And he's going to need an ally because there will be times when school's really frustrating. And to know that you've been through it is comforting. So, memorization of math facts, really like just straight flashcards, flashing numbers at your kid and expecting them to recall is the most inefficient way to teach a student with dyscalculia, even dyslexia. That is just not going to work in the long run. We actually teach a lot of math back classes, Lindsay. So if you're feeling nervous, and I'm just trying to alleviate anxiety for you, what I would recommend is signing up for a class with him in January and you both join the class. I think you'll see that the methods we use are so different. So again, they're very hands-on, and I do not have my manipulatives close by because I just recently moved into this house and a lot of them are in storage. And I think I said that in the last webinar, and I was hoping I would have them unpacked by now, but I don't. But again, those beads that we were talking about, that is such an important manipulative for these students to have, because they're usually quite strong visualizers. So they can hold those beads in their hands and they've got a better sense of the numbers and they can start seeing it in their head. So they don't have to carry it around with them all of the time. But again, that narrowing the math facts is really important. And then any way you can gamify playing and practicing math facts with him is the way to go. And for both of you, because it's a struggle, what I would say is we're going to narrow those math facts, and then you're going to make a list of the math facts you're working on. So if you were working on sevens, you would just seriously have a little piece of paper with the sevens times table written out next to you, and then you're going to play the games. And it's just at that point lowering anxiety and trying to work on that recall of those math facts. And when you're playing the games you need to play need to be highly visual, dice, dominoes, those kinds of things. So if you came to one of our classes in January, you would see all of these games being played, and it's something you two could do together, and it would be way more enjoyable because it's something that's way more fun, honestly. Anytime we can gamify something, the students are learning it so much faster. Is there anything you would add, Sally, about that? Let's see. Oh, Sally. I don't know if you have anything to add, Sally, but you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Okay, yes, I was talking, didn't know I was muted. Okay, so I just added in the chat that in my experience, kids don't learn anything when they're forced, especially something they will fail at. So we can invite, we can inspire, and we can achieve goals through providing appropriate and accessible instruction. So you kind of gave some ideas for the accessible instruction by playing games, making it fun and non-threatening, and helping them feel successful with it. I don't think memorizing math facts is an effective strategy for most kids. My kiddo with dyslexia and dyscalculia, he learned his math facts, and he still has difficulty with the recall because he has low working memory and slow processing, but he figured out different strategies. He's good with strings of numbers. So he used that strategy of, I can skip count, so I'm going to skip count. And then if I add one more group to that, or I subtract a group from that, it will give me the answer. So it takes him longer, but he can get to those. He can still access those facts, even if they're not quickly memorized by and with automaticity.
Yes.
So we give kids all kinds of different strategies to access learning facts, but with my kiddo, I give him a multiplication cheat sheet because I know he understands the concepts behind it, and I know that he just has a difficulty with the quick recall all the time. So
yeah, absolutely. And then I think another thing, Lindsay, that people gravitate to is they look for other ways and that to learn math facts. And so I will caution you against some programs that rely on storytelling to remember the math facts. That can work for some kids, but sometimes the stories consume the mind so much, it takes up too much of the working memory and leaves very little room to actually do the process that they need to. So we prefer these highly visual options instead of that more language-based story-like math facts, just because of that alone. And sometimes when we got a student that learned that way, we have to wean them off and start working on that mental math piece because there's no room to learn the concepts that they need at that time. So, but I highly encourage you to maybe check out one of our classes. I think you'll find that it's fun, it's different, kids love it. It's a good experience all the way around. Okay, Sally, what other questions did you see that I should definitely?
Valerie says, how do you know if the different variables are dyscalculia or just aspects that contribute to learning challenges?
Okay. How do you know if I'm sorry, I'm like getting sleepy here. So how do you know if the different variables of dyscalculia are just aspects that contribute to learning challenges? So
I
Valerie,
think it's asking how do you know if it's a math learning disability or
or if
just
it's
struggling with math because maybe they have dyslexia or another
sure,
challenge?
right, or it's just anxiety or those kinds of
Yeah.
things. So Valerie, if that's not what you're asking, let us know, but I think that's what you're saying. So yeah, one of the best things you could do in that case, if you're not exactly sure, is getting one of those evaluations done. It'll really tease out the data and let you see kind of what's happening. Um, and the dyscalculia label in and of itself is not a bad one to get. Like, even if it isn't necessarily the whole reason why your child's struggling with math, it's okay to have that label, because in the public school setting, it's going to mean you're going to have more accommodations and options available to you. So I don't stress too much about, is it dyslexia, is it auditory processing, or is it really dyscalculia? Because I'm more interested in getting my child the supports and things that they need at school. So doing an assessment like that, especially if they do the FAM, you're going to see a lot more data about how your child thinks, and a lot of that will be very revealing. And then we have had experiences where it truly is just math anxiety. The student comes to us, they are high strung, they can do the math, but they need that validation from another adult that their brain's okay, that the way they think is okay, and the anxiety starts to go down and the performance goes up. So it really takes a good assessment and also a knowledgeable person to intervene and work with your child to make those differences, to help you figure out what it is that's really causing the problems. Let me know if that didn't answer your question.
Yeah, Valerie said that we got the question correct, and
Okay, good.
she is wondering how, she said they've done psych evals in the past and evaluation, both a neuropsych eval as well as one at the school district. How do I go about asking for the FAM assessment? Do you mind if I just comment on that really quick?
Yeah, sure, Sally.
So in my experience, neuropsychs and even school psychologists are not familiar with the FAM assessment.
It's pretty new. Yeah.
It's important when you look for a neuropsych or you do a school evaluation to specifically ask if they can do that assessment. However, Math for Middle does do the assessment and it's amazing. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah. So we do have team members that are trained in the FAM. If you'd like help with that, we're putting it inside of an advocacy package, because again, like just what you just described, like they have all this data, and then the evaluators don't necessarily give really helpful recommendations or don't really know what to tell you to do with math. And so if you came to us, we can do that assessment and then give you a few coaching calls with Ruth on our team, who can help you figure out exactly what to ask for at the school. So go ahead and send us an email if that's something you'd like more information on. I would be happy to provide that, and I will try to remember to put it in the email that goes out with this recording. But the best way to get in contact with us is through our main email address, which is hello@madeformath.com.
Okay, I
Any?
think there's just 2 more questions. Are you
Okay.
up for that, Adrienne?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, the first one's pretty simple. Are your homeschool courses open for enrollment mid-year?
Oh, Michelle, I wish I could say yes, but no, they're not. Our homeschool classes are super hard right now. And it's again because we've got all these kids on very different levels trying to be together in a group class. It's really not the optimal way to serve these students. So if you were interested in the homeschool classes, I actually would recommend like doing some of our shorter term classes. And they're the same kind of instruction that we're doing in those homeschool classes. They're just shorter commitments, and you can kind of pick and choose what topics you'd like to do. So that's what I would recommend for that. The homeschool classes, they're okay. And really what the difference is in some of the classes that are going really well and the other classes that are struggling is that the classes that are going well are students that we worked with in a one-to-one situation before, so we know them really well. And because we know all of those students, we're able to place them appropriately. The classes where the kids are really struggling is we don't know them as well. And so we're finding that there's some pretty big gaps between what the kids can do, even though they're close in age. And so my team begged me not to let anyone in this year because they are just fighting to keep these kids engaged and make sure they're serving everyone at those various levels. So the multi-week classes are better because it's topic specific instead of trying to look at it like grade level wise. Okay, what's the next question?
Yeah, I think this is the last one. Jane says, I'm curious what resources you might recommend for the K2 grade range for VAC help, the multisensory help. Curriculum, tutoring, specific manipulative or programs. We're using popsicle sticks now to help my 8-year-old master addition and subtraction facts from 1 to 10.
Yes.
That was a lot.
Popsicle sticks are great, and Jane, you've seen us use them too, but we also use centimeter cubes. You can get a bucket of 1,000 on Amazon for probably $30. We use those, base 10 blocks. It's important to use multiple types of manipulatives for that place value. It helps them generalize the concept between quantity and numbers. So that they understand that 5 popsicle sticks is the same as 5 centimeter cubes. You would think that they would be able to make that bridge, but some kids don't. Like they're different enough that they're like, I'm not sure. So those are really helpful. As far as curriculum, another program that, well, I don't have there's no teacher manual that you can have access to, but you could do a general search for Bridges Home Connection PDFs, and I can send some of those out to Jane in the email. And those are great. There's a few tweaks that I wish they would make. A, not as many problems per page. B, subitizing. And subitizing is organizing things in patterns. So with your popsicle sticks, when you make a group of 5 with your son, you make tally marks. So you do 4 and then 1 that goes diagonally across or straight across. That subitizing is really important for these students. And unfortunately, Bridges did not use subitizing in every example in their PDFs. And so when we use them as a team, we have to adjust them for that. But I like the activities that are in there. It's good instruction, but with a few tweaks. So you could definitely do that as a homeschooler and look at those and use them with your son. Okay. Yeah, Bridges Home Connections. Yes, perfect. Yes, that's the one. So you do a general search, it'll pull up. I think there's K through 5 usually available online and you can find it. Okay, anything else, Sally, that I missed?
Nope, I think that's it.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here. We're so glad you're here. Next webinar that we're going to do is, I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but basically the general concept is when you as the parent, something's off, but the school isn't saying much about it, but you can sense that there's something wrong. Many of you here in this group already know and experience this and are working with the school. So that webinar is more for a parent who's just starting the process of realizing hey, my kiddo's struggling with learning to read, or hey, math seems to be going really bumpy. What's going on? They're just starting their journey. And so that is for who that is. So if you have some friends that maybe you have thought I see something with their kid, but I feel a little weird about saying something, you could recommend the webinar as a resource to them, and we'll give them multiple starting points on how to start that journey and where to go to get help. So that's what the next one will be. And if you have a recommendation for a webinar, we would love to hear it. Again, like Sally and I have lots of ideas, but we want to hear from you too. So when I send the recording out, feel free to hit reply. And if there's something specific that you'd like to learn about, please let us know. We would love to put something together. Sometimes when you work like we do as a team, we're so close to the topic that we forget that maybe you don't know some of the things that we know, and we'd love to share and educate. So feel free to reply and let us know. But otherwise, that's it for tonight. Thank you for being here and for joining me. I know it was right during dinner time, so I apologize for that. But we'll try to have some varying times for you in the future. We'll see you all later.